Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. Haven't done one of these solo podcasts in a while. I thought I would try to get something out here, and hopefully, if I'm able to kind of keep doing these once a quarter, and just share some different things that are going on, or thoughts, or whatever that I'm dealing with, things that might interest you. And I wanted to share something. I had the opportunity recently to speak to some students here, some college students, and talk about sort of time-tested approaches to city building. And one aspect of that kind of led me down a tangential rabbit hole. And that rabbit hole had to do with, one topic I wanted to share with the students was that, just the basic notion that the way things are, or the way you see things as they are, is not a given. Like the things that we see in our communities that we're used to, maybe we've been around for a long time, or a lot of our lives, are not. They don't necessarily always have to be the way they are. And this seems like an obvious thing to say. I know it. But I think a lot of times we find that people get really hung up on this notion that like major things, that the way they are just the way they've always been, or any number of things are the way they've always been, when in fact they really haven't been. And so let me give you a few examples, because I know that sounds very vague in general. But one of the things that we've run across before is talking about like how we have freeways through American cities. And so people who like to call themselves urbanists, we know that it wasn't always this way. That the idea of designing and building a major freeway right through a city was something that was just conceived of by human beings. It was a very radical proposition when it happened, and that largely all of that happened within the last 70 years or so. A lot of those original thoughts probably started about 100 years ago, but weren't really fully implemented until about the 1950s and 60s. But most people today, when they see the freeways as they are cutting through a city, they've lived their whole life, using them, driving on them, and getting around the city that way. They just think, well, that's just the way it is. And I think about this because I told a story when I was talking to students that several years ago, there was a study to reconceive or improve the downtown freeway loop here in Kansas City, Missouri. And it was kind of done in a classic fashion, where the state DOT, the State Department of Transportation, hired a big engineering firm to do a study. And that engineering firm is a firm that does a lot of freeway work, a lot of infrastructure work. They're really well connected to local and state government, because those are the kind of firms that do that kind of work. There's a very small number of engineering firms and contractors that are the ones that actually get and execute a lot of the work that we see for big infrastructure projects. And at the time, they were doing some outreach and some community meetings to just discuss this. And I'll be the first to say that on most of those kinds of studies, the actual outreach is really just kind of a token effort. I hate to say it that way, but especially on a lot of state DOT projects, it's really just kind of box checking. They're contractually required to do a certain amount of community engagement, and so they do it. and I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying this is kind of the way it is. That these firms then will schedule some meetings with focus groups or interest groups and meet. And so I happened to go to a group. I think it was probably a focus group for people interested on the real estate side in downtown Kansas City. And so, it was interesting because the meeting was um, basically to talk about some of the ideas they had for what in their mind were improvements to the downtown freeway loop, which was improvements as a traffic engineer would see them primarily. And that had a lot to do with changing traffic flow and patterns. And actually they wanted to reduce the number of exits into the downtown area and centralize the traffic flow even more than what it already is. Kansas City has a loop that surrounds its downtown like a lot of American cities do. It's actually a very tight loop compared to many. So there are problems with it. Even from a strict traffic standpoint, it's confusing and often kind of fraught with hazards in terms of creating accidents and everything else. So, I was a younger guy at the time and being a little more brash, I just basically said, well, excuse me, why do we need to have this freeway loop at all? This freeway system that we have in the city was only really designed and built in the 1950s and 60s. It was not, conceived of by God and handed down to Moses on tablets. This was built by fallible human beings who had a certain idea at the time of what they thought was a good idea. And it's as in fact caused us a lot of problems. It really carved up and divided the city. It's turned much of downtown into a series of parking lots and big roads for moving traffic. And it's hard to see from a downtown standpoint how what we did was really a net positive. So why don't we just get rid of the whole thing? And, of course, heads exploded. The idea that that was even possible seems crazy, right? And then another person who I knew in the room kind of chimed in and said, because somebody said something about radical changes like that, and he stood up and said, the truth is the radical thing was building the freeways in the first place. And I thought to myself, yeah, that's actually the right way to say it. That the idea that you would rip out existing neighborhoods full of people and businesses and homes for infrastructure so that people could drive really fast to far-flung areas, that was really radical. And that you would have these massive amounts of money poured in from the federal government to do it was even more radical. But it happened. And that's not how the city existed for many, many decades before that. And it was something that was just basically created by human beings. So, obviously our comments really, as these things go, they didn't go anywhere. In fact, nothing really happened out of that study. There were some recommendations made for improvements, but and the reality is that it's even to try to make the kinds of improvements the engineers wanted to make required a large amount of money that the state at the time didn't really have, and there wasn't really consensus to make the changes. So that particular effort didn't really materialize into anything. But it did help me kind of clarify that this notion that you can't just accept things as they are. There's no reason to accept things as they are. That freeway system, again, as I mentioned, that was not something that has to be that way. It can change. It should change. It needs to change. If we were properly motivated and lined up to make those changes, it would change. And in fact, many cities have made changes to urban freeways, and that was part of the rationale we talked about at that time, that that other cities have taken the lead, removed urban freeways that weren't really necessary, and made improvements to their cities in the process, made them more livable, more enjoyable, and work better, and frankly, more fiscally sustainable. And so, one thing that I've come across so often is that there's definitely a lot of people who see the world as it is, and they think, well, it is what it is. My least favorite phrase in the world, right? That we just have to accept things as they are, but we don't. We don't have to accept things as they are. So much of our world was created, especially all the things that humans have done were just created by other human beings, and they can be changed. Many of them need to change. It's okay to think about change, and it's actually okay to think about very big change and often very radical change, because sometimes that's just really needed. I also think about, there are other examples when you go back in really not terribly distant history. Um, you know, about 100 years ago, almost every public transportation system in America was privately owned and for profit. And that seems like a crazy notion to us now, because almost every, transit system today is perennially looking for more and more public dollars to support its capital and operations. But for decades after the creation of public transit, whether it was horse-drawn trolleys or anything else, these were corporations, and they made money, and they used public space often to run their lines or their operations. But these were for profit, and they ultimately went away because, again, we had this the same sort of spirit that involved the creation of the freeways with massive amounts of federal money. The same thing happened at the state and local level with massive amounts of state and local money to build roadways, and especially large roadways, to make it easier to drive faster and longer distances. And I think, many of us who love cities, we look at those decisions made today and we say those decisions were bad. They caused a lot of harm. We should rethink those decisions. In fact, those were so bad, we ought to turn the tide completely 180 degrees and be more aligned like what we used to be, with a focus not so much on creating infrastructure for very long commutes, but creating infrastructure for people in communities and places. And when we did that change about 100 years ago, it was the death knell for those privately owned transit operators, those corporations. And so many of them effectively either closed or sold off to their local governments to become public entities. And as a result, the operations have had a dwindling and not great effect for many, many years in cities all over the country, to the extent that there are cities like mine that have what at times feels like a barely functioning bus system. And that is entirely reliant on public funding, and for which the operations of that is very political and gets often very nasty about who's going to fund what. And instead of thinking that this was just a service that people need and are willing to pay a little bit of money for to get around a city, that's all that it really is. But we created a system 100 years ago that took the viability of it and smashed it into the ground. And it's not the only major change we made. That was a change made by human beings, many of whom, again, I think thought they were doing the right thing, thought they were doing the progressive thing, thought they were doing the modern thing, and really made radical changes in our society. If you think about city planning, one of the big bugaboos these days has been a growing awareness of how zoning in cities has been a major force to create the housing crisis that we have today. That zoning itself, by the rules that are set up, by the processes that are set up to try to build things, it has created so many hurdles to make the construction of housing slow and difficult, which is true. And it is a major contributing factor as why we can't build enough housing supply to satisfy the demand, especially in high demand cities that just generally can't get out of their own way to build enough housing. And so we've got all manner of possible solutions now that have been imposed or are considered being imposed from state governments and even the federal government to force cities to really open up their zoning so that it's easier to build. But the reality is we have this complex web of local regulations and processes that are not easy to untangle, no matter where we start. It's an amazing contrast to the era just prior to when zoning was adopted. And I've talked about this in presentations before, but when you think about the first great wave of immigration to the United States from Europe, which was from roughly 1880 to about 1920, I think we had about 30 million immigrants that came to the country at a time period when in 1870 or 80, there were only 30 million people to begin with. So it was a massive wave of immigration. And many of those immigrants moved to cities in the upper Midwest and the Midwest. And cities like Kansas City saw a tremendous boom in population from 1870 to 1920. And probably the starkest example is Chicago and how quickly it went from a very small city to a very, very large city. And in that period, we were still somehow able to build housing, immense amounts of housing for people, so that growth could be accommodated and the accompanying growth in incomes for middle-class people as well. And so I've often said in that era, we not only were able to house people, but we also built many of the most beloved neighborhoods in the country that are still the most beloved today with incredible architecture and all of the quote unquote missing middle components that we lament we don't have anymore. If you happen to be a city that had a growth spurt during that era, you're actually very fortunate because you probably have tremendous architecture and neighborhoods that were built as a result of it and are still valued today. All of that was done before we ever had a zoning ordinance or a planning commission in almost every city in America. Zoning really didn't come into play until the 1920s. And frankly, the initial zoning ordinances were so small and so modest in scope that we probably wouldn't even recognize them today. Many of them were just printed on small booklets that were a handful of pages. A whole lot of communities didn't really fully adopt zoning until the 1950s, after World War II, because frankly, there just wasn't a lot of building going on. We had about a 20-year period where really not much was built because of the Great Depression and World War II. So, for a lot of people, again, people who are not mired in the world of planning and development, and they hear about things related to like zoning and everything else, they tend to think, well, what we have is just always what we've had, or it's right somehow. And it's been well thought out and all the trade-offs have been considered. Well, the truth of the matter is zoning as we do it in the United States is only about 100 years old. It came in at that same time period that we were changing so many other things in our cities, changing how we built and financed infrastructure, like I mentioned before. And today, I think most of us in our world acknowledge, you know what? It's a good thing to reconsider what we've done with zoning. In fact, there is a pretty substantial movement of people across a lot of different political beliefs to say, you know what? It might not be a bad thing if we just if zoning was just eliminated completely. If the Supreme Court case Euclid v. Ambler, which enabled states and cities to adopt zoning ordinances, if that were somehow overturned, that may not be a bad thing. Now, there are a lot of people who'd be horrified to hear something like that. But there are good reasons that people now across the political spectrum say it's something to think seriously about. It's something to take under serious consideration. What we have isn't really working for us anymore. If you go back in history and think about planning commissions were set up in this country to be advisory boards of professionals and business people to advise elected officials on good city building and good city planning. Because it came along essentially at the tail end of the City Beautiful era as one of the reforms that a lot of business people thought were necessary, because they felt like a lot of elected officials didn't know what made for a beautiful or good or functioning city or town, a well-planned place. And so the idea was planning commissions would be these advisory boards that would meet occasionally, and they would give professional advice to elected officials. 100 years later, what planning commissions are doing is spending enormous amounts of time in public hearings dealing with, the color of somebody's house or fence, or the difference between 2 feet on a setback or not, or frankly just micromanaging every possible building project that could happen in a city or town. So it's instead of it becoming this sort of thoughtful advisory committee where it's really giving esteemed advice to help people who are dealing with day-to-day issues, it's actually become a body that just is mired in day-to-day issues. And that's pretty typical in jurisdictions all across the country. Another way we look at things that have changed, there's been a lot of really good discussion in recent years that highlights some of the challenges that small children and children are having today in a world that is so technology driven. And one of the things that's been highlighted is how few children these days actually walk to school. And so, how many are getting out and using their own 2 feet, getting around? As a result, does that have an impact on childhood obesity, which has really skyrocketed? TLDR, it does have an impact. So it's kind of a crazy thing. If you're somebody who's about my age, I'm 55 years old. If you're my age or older, there's a very good chance that you walk to school as a kid, at least for elementary school. If you're younger than me, there's a very good chance you didn't walk to school. And there's many, many reasons for that. But one of the biggest reasons has just been school consolidation and the push for larger and larger schools that then there are fewer of that are on more remote sites. And again, this is something that came out of policy and ideas that other human beings had that they thought was a good idea at the time, coming out of, again, starting in that era of the 1920s and evolving after World War II. The idea was to be modern, to be efficient. We need to have fewer schools that are more technically and professionally run. And these would be really efficient uses of taxpayer dollars. And so we need to get rid of some of these smaller schools that don't work as well and consolidate kids into larger schools. They'll have more opportunities there for education and everything else. And that'll be a better society for us. Well, we can argue whether that was true, any of that was true or not. I don't think it's true. I think it's frankly obvious that the opposite has been true. But what has also happened as a secondary effect is that since kids aren't really walking to school as much anymore, they're just not moving their bodies very much. They're not being as physical. People are not as connected in their own neighborhoods as they used to be. And it's been a contributing factor to how communities get fractured and start to really struggle. Because in many cases, let's say, again, if you're older than me, that school was like the heart of the neighborhood. And it was really the heart and soul of what was going on in that place. And when it was lost, it kind of rips the beating heart out. So again, it's just to say the way things are today with our large consolidated schools does not have to be this way. Those were decisions that were made by people. Those decisions can be changed. It's okay. We changed courses and changed decisions all the time. The idea of kids not being able to walk to school is not really that is not historically a normal thing. The idea of driving everywhere for all manner of activities or sitting in a car and writing is not also a normal thing. Throughout the long course of human history, we mostly walked to things. We mostly lived our lives within a fairly small area. And if we wanted to go further, we would ride a bike or take a vehicle to get us there. But a whole lot of life was within an easy walk. And the fact that we don't have that today is, again, that is the abnormal thing. And for us to want to change that, again, is okay. So I think a lot of people who consider themselves urbanists would say that we do need to change those things, that a lot of this hasn't worked. And we need to open our minds to some fairly radical changes because this kind of mass-produced, what Strong Towns calls the suburban experiment, has not been good for our communities, has not been good for our country, and really hasn't been good for human beings. So the sort of two phases of the post-war era, the mass-produced era, where we did incredible radical physical change quickly, and then the second phase where we turn into the sort of the post Jane Jacobs era, where everything became about a local decision, and we can't build anything anywhere without meetings, all manner of meetings with either neighborhoods, planning commissions, or city governments. That sort of almost a stifling version of local control. That hasn't been good either. And so people in the planning, design, and development world have been open to rethinking this, which is good. I think we do need to rethink all this. The same thing is true about how our institutions are organized. And, one thing that is in the news a lot these days is sort of a lot of fear about rethinking how things are organized at the federal level. And I'll set that aside for a minute to just talk about the local level. Much of how we organize and run city governments, again, was basically invented about 100 years ago. The idea that we have this kind of scientific, technical city staff that was really running the day-to-day of a city and managing all aspects of life in a city, that was a new idea a little over 100 years ago. And they would be implementing the ideas. They would implement policies like zoning, like how we build infrastructure today, and that you would have all of this professional staff that would do it. And that came out of an era of what we call the spoils system, where there was a lot of abuse and where elected officials were often really the ones who were directly running local governments. And so it was a reaction to that. But we've had this system now for 100 years, and I think it's easy to look around and say, you know what, there are some things that were done well. There were some good things that came out of this. There's a whole lot of problems too. There are a whole lot of things, in fact, that just aren't really working very well. There's a lot about that system, the systems that we've created, that make it very, very hard to do much of anything. There are not great feedback loops, not always very good transparency, and that the larger a lot of these local governments get, the more calcified they become, and the harder it is for citizens to do much of anything in their own community, whether it's get a crosswalk painted or start a business or build a carriage house. That all of it just gets harder and harder. And that is all an outgrowth of the way that we reorganized our local governments. The same is true of our school systems. Our school systems in this country, the way we do public schools, in many ways, was organized on the Prussian school model, not Russian, but Prussian (PR) model that was then eventually transported to America about 150 years ago and adopted wholesale across the country as a uh, as a educational method, but also an organizational method. And the cynical ones would say the Prussian model was really about creating conformity and loyalty to the state, and that was really the intent of that model. Which, in many ways, that's what the Prussians were trying to do. They were trying to bring some order out of chaos and bring and create a state that people were loyal to, and by educating kids from the youngest age to bring them into that system. And I'm not one to say that system is all bad. I went through that system. I certainly don't think I was ruined by it. But there are challenges and problems with that system. It doesn't work for a lot of kids. There's a whole lot of kids who really don't thrive in the way that we've organized schools. And there's also the whole question of, how we organize public school districts. Does the way we do it is the best way to do it? I've lived in places where the entire county is one school district, and you have hundreds of thousands of kids in one district that's managed by, one board of education that is 5 or 7 people. I now live in a public school district where it's not organized by county, but there are multiple districts within the county, but the one that I'm in has 14,000 students in it, and it's managed by a school board of, I think, five people or so. And just like we changed city government so that we would have this kind of elected board, but that really was the professional staff that runs everything and does all the scientific technical work. We kind of did that with school districts, and large school districts in particular. And if you look around, if you're honest, our outcomes are not great. They really aren't great with this system. And it maybe was great for a time. Maybe it worked really well for a time period after it was originally done. And then times change and it just doesn't work well anymore. And so I am, again, the kind of person that says it's okay for us to look at that and say, let's rethink it completely. It's okay. It's okay to rethink these things. A lot of the way our institutions are organized, again, was only invented by fallible human beings, and often within the last 100 to 150 years. It's okay for us to completely reconceive this. There's so much of our society that was really only created about 100 years ago. And for the first probably 20 or 30 years, we didn't really know what the impacts were because of the Great Depression and World War II. And then I've long said the period after the war, for a generation after the war, we should almost set aside as a completely anomalous period in American history, because we had won World War II, and we had effectively no competitors in the world economy for a generation. And we were by far and away the dominant force economically, culturally, everything else in the world. But eventually people caught up or started catching up, as you would expect, and things started to change and what I would say is normalize again. And so we say that a lot of these things were invented maybe 100 years ago or so, but really in many cases, only about 40 or 50 years have we been in a more typical, I would say, condition of how our country exists respective to other countries in the world. And you can look around and see some things that worked and see a whole lot of stuff that didn't work. And so it doesn't scare me to say, let's reconceive this. Let's rethink about it. And let's reset our expectations. I, for one, I've always been a little bit focused on that. I think we should care about results. I don't think we should have low expectations for public institutions. I think we should expect our governments to be able to do things and do them well and do them quickly when speed is necessary. We should expect safety. We should expect cleanliness. We should expect efficiency in operations. I don't think any of that is radical. Um, and it's we have often come to a place, especially for those of us who live in places where you have a really large local government, where we just always expect the local government to do a lousy job. And that's terrible. That's bad for our cities. It's bad for our society. And we need to reset that expectation that that stuff is not okay. But at the same time, I think it's wise for us also all to look around and say, the way things are, the way things are built, the way things are financed, the way we do things, none of this is inevitable. All of it is up for discussion. All of it should be discussed. There's no reason to expect that the kind of a place, stamping out the same places over and over, regardless of where you are in the continent, that they all look the same. There's no reason for it to be that way. Historically, it wasn't that way. That was what we have achieved. It was kind of the goal of a bunch of very radical thinkers 100 years ago. And those radical thinkers are dead and gone, and we have to live with the results. So let's put our own thinking caps on. Let's think about how we could make changes. I'm often reminded of, I'll kind of wrap things up here, but just another example where I'll show presentations that show these historic pictures of Main Street here in Kansas City, a certain section of Main Street that if I took you to today, it's a portion of the road that was 5 lanes wide. It's a wide section. It's kind of blown out. A lot of the buildings have been torn down, but it's through an urban area. And I have this great photo from the 1920s that show the exact section of street, much narrower, beautiful mature trees along the street, beautiful buildings alongside it. And along the sides of the photo are all the dashed lines of where the street is to be widened to accommodate more traffic. Now, every urbanist that I know, I'm really getting tired of using that word, but it's what I have for now. It's the term I can use. But every urbanist I know would be horrified by that. And you look at the picture and you say, look at what we lost. Look at what we tore down. We did that just so that people could drive faster through the city. That's the only reason. You can say people will say we did it to accommodate cars. No, we didn't accommodate cars. We did it to accommodate cars going fast so that people could traverse a city quickly. That was the reason. You can see the same thing in before and after pictures over and over and over again of wonderful American cities, beautiful, beautiful places that we built. And you see these pictures in the 1920s and you see the after picture. And it's just shocking. I show one sometimes. I think it was San Bernardino, California, had this gorgeous main street in downtown that was completely and utterly torn down and for a shopping mall. And has, the same shot of it now is basically a mall parking lot. And there's story after story like this all over the country. Major radical change that we did that was not good for it. And it wasn't good for it because it wasn't grounded in time-tested principles for what people like about places. That's something urbanists intuitively understand, that the idea of walking around a place, seeing other human beings, having space where we congregate together in public, that is actually the human norm. And that's what's good for us as people. We need that. We need that sociability. So when we see these photos of this radical change that's done, we're often horrified at it. But a lot of other big changes were done in the same way. Changes about how we manage our cities, how we organize our institutions. And I think we need to look at those as well. So in the coming months, I'm hoping to write some more pieces about this topic where I want to share some more ideas about that. I'm certain people will say those are radical ideas. We can't possibly do that. It's so dangerous. But I think we're in a time where we need to rethink these things. It's okay. When things aren't working well, you need to do it. In businesses, when they're not working well, the business just goes broke, and everybody loses their job and they move on to do something else. And unfortunately, a lot of our public institutions just continue to kind of drag on with mediocrity or worse for a long time until there's an opportunity to really rethink it, or places just die as a result. There's a whole lot of communities that just kind of keep doing what they're doing until they just can't do it anymore. And then the community effectively dies. I think we have agency, and we can look at things and change them if we need to. And we should when we have the opportunity. So that's my message for today. I hope you found that interesting, and I look forward to hearing from any of you in the comments. Please hit that like, follow, or subscribe button wherever you can on a podcast app. I'm really pleased with how many of you are listening and commenting and sharing the podcast. Had some really great guests on lately, and I'm looking forward to doing more here in the coming weeks. And I will talk to you soon.